What's up guys, RoySFord, and yeah, I've been using a camera like this SLR for years. Yeah, it is a huge camera, a lot of buttons on it, and now it's digital. But let's give you some of the basics, huh? Come on, let's go, let's go.
Ooh-wee, okay. Let's jump right into it. I know you guys are probably wondering, okay, what? Just some quick camera basics. A lot of you guys probably already know these, but for those of you who don't, this will be really helpful for you. If you get a camera, you're probably thinking to yourself, I probably want to do photos on it. Obviously, that's the main purpose. But I may want to do some videography, shoot some video, go cinematic on it. Okay, yeah, here's some of the basics. Starting with ISO, International Standard, no. ISO, or International Organization of Standardization, they flip the S and the O, but don't worry about that. You're just worrying about your sensitivity for your light. ISO, okay, so if you're looking at it, it's just how much light is getting into your sensor or onto film. It's a film term that is migrated onto your camera, which is okay. It's how much light is getting in. The higher that number, ISO 1600, the more light is getting in. But you're gonna sacrifice that by getting more grain and noise into your image. The lower that number, the less light there is. For example, ISO 100 is getting a lot less light into your sensor or on the film than it would if you're at ISO 1600 or higher. So by controlling the ISO, you actually control how much light is getting into the camera. And for certain cameras, there are also what they call native ISOs. For this camera, the Canon 60D, and maybe similar others, the native ISO is the one where the camera acts best at. In this case, 160 ISO is 320, and so I think ISO 640 is another number that works natively. You can always look these numbers up for your specific camera and model. The next setting is the shutter speed, and it's measured in seconds. You can start at 1 second, 2 seconds, 1/30th of a second, 1/40th of a second, 1/50th of a second, 1/200th of a second, and so forth and so on. The smaller that number, in this case, for you guys, I'll explain it this way. When you start going at 1/50th of a second to 1/200th of a second, the higher that bottom number, and I'll just start saying 200th or 250th, or if you're going even higher than that, 1,000th of a second, your frame rate is actually slowing down the action. If you're shooting on a athletic field, doing either football or basketball, wherever you are, even soccer, you want to freeze the frame for sports. You want to get a crystal clear freeze frame and not have blur as all the action is happening. So the higher that number, I say higher just because it's not really, it's actually doing less and less and less of a second. So yeah, your frame rate does not play a role until we get into the video side, but your shutter speed does for photography and video. I'll cover this a little bit more detail when we get into the next step. Then of course, if you have your ISO, you have your aperture. Now your aperture is actually a part of the lens of the camera, and that adjusts based on how much light you want to get into the lens. And they usually come at f-stops. And so if your f-stop is set at 3.5 or it's set at 1.8, your f-stop is letting a lot of light into the camera. For this setup, I'm actually going at 3.5, which is wide open for this particular lens. But also my 50mm lens can go as wide as 1.8, which is letting in a lot of light into the lens, thus making a whole lot of cool features happen. But if you're outdoors and you want a less bright image, you would set that aperture all the way up somewhere around 11, maybe 12, 15, 22. Yeah, I know, I'm talking a lot of numbers and it's getting really crazy, I know. But just understand this, the more you play with the aperture, the more cooler things are gonna look. That low number, 1.8, is gonna make it so that your field of view, your focus field, is gonna be shorter and more compact, meaning that only certain sections of your field of view will be in focus. You can get my face in focus, but not the background. Or you can get the background in focus and blow out everything that's in the foreground. So by having a really low f-stop at 1.8, you're gonna notice this field of view or field of focus change. The higher that number, obviously, the more things you can get in focus from the foreground all the way back to the background. Woo! Basics of photography. Yes, that was a whole bunch of numbers. Now let's get into the video. The basics of video for your camera if you're shooting with a DSLR. For video recording, all the stuff for photo does apply, and there are some key changes that you want to do specifically for things that you don't want to adjust once you get the camera going. First things first, your frames per second and your shutter speed. Those two are linked together. So whereas when you're shooting photography, these two can fly independent, you know, you don't even really have to worry about a frames per second because you're not shooting videos, and your shutter speed can be all over the place. It doesn't really matter. But for video, it's a little different if you want to keep that motion blur look and consistency and keep it cinematic. If you're shooting your video and your frame rates are set at 24 frames per second, like we do in general, you want to double your shutter speed. Double it. That's right, 24, go it up to 48. And most cameras here in the US will shoot at 1/50th of a second. So you're at 50. And so you're doubling that 24, getting it up to 48, or in this case, 50 on your shutter speed. And obviously, the faster your frame rate, the more information that's coming in. Setting your camera at 60 frames per second instead of your 24 frames per second, you want to get your shutter speed up to 120th of a second. Yeah, a lot of numbers, but simplifying the look, you want it to look as clean with this nice clean motion blur, and then you take this 60 frames per second and you can put it into your computer, or you can put it into a frame rate that is set at 24 frames. In this case, get your project slow at 24 frames. Take this 60 frames per second footage, slow it down, make these buttery smooth images with slow-mo in your project. That's the trick to it. Now for video recording, it's a little bit different in that you have a native ISO. That is a particular thing you have to look at, whether your camera works best in certain ISO settings. My camera, this 60D, actually works best at 160, 320, and 640 ISO. But you would have to go and see if your specific camera has certain native ISOs that work. Elsewise, you probably also know this too, when it gets really dark, you start boosting up your ISO. I know on my camera, I try not to go over 1600 ISO, elsewise it'll have too much noise into the video footage. But it differs from camera to camera. But just know that the higher your ISO, the more likely you're gonna get noise into your video. But Roy, what about shooting out in the sun? Okay, I would highly recommend you get an ND filter. I have a circular one, which actually as you turn it, it goes from clear to dark, almost like putting a pair of sunglasses, so that I can retain my aperture at a lower aperture and kind of still get this nice clean look without having to adjust too much in camera. It's essentially putting sunglasses onto your camera lens. The ND filter comes in many different shapes and sizes. You want to get one for your specific lens that you want to use or that you intend to use. Or you can get multiple ones. You know, Mr. Moneybags over here. You can get all the ND filters you want.
Okay, so yeah, there may be some questions you have, or something maybe I didn't answer. Okay, so cool. That's what you're here for. Drop it down below in the comments. I'll make sure specifically to answer your question, or maybe you have a basic that I skipped over in this video. Likewise, go ahead, drop it down in the comments. Obviously, there are a couple of videos that talk about photography as well as video hints and tricks that you can use. I'll put it right over here for you. And as always, guys, I'll talk to you next time.